Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Let me introduce myself. I'm Susan Hopgood, the President of Education International, Federal Secretary of the Australian Education Union. I welcome you all to this conference, Union Standing for Democracy, Social Justice and Equality. And I'd like to welcome to the viewers on Facebook live stream. This meeting is restricted to elected members from Public Services International and Education International. Participants will listen in the language of the speaker. Therefore, it's important for anyone wishing to use the interpretation services to follow the instructions provided and download the Interpretify app and type in the token Democracy 2020. The language choices will appear, and interpretation is in English, French, Spanish, German, and Japanese. And just a few friendly reminders. To the guest speakers, could you speak slowly and clearly so that the interpreters can follow? Questions are invited from EI and PSI participants on the Zoom chat. However, not all will be able to be answered due to time constraints. And any remarks and comments shared in the chat will be collected and issued with the report. And finally, we ask that only the speakers on the program activate their camera. Other participants are requested to mute and put their camera off. Colleagues, friends, there is a crisis in democracy in many countries, not just in fragile democracies, but in some of the oldest and most stable democracies in the world. The pandemic and its economic consequences, and the repression and human rights abuses that put Black Lives Matter front and centre have reaffirmed and deepened our alarm. A functioning democracy depends on the health of society. It is anchored in equality and social justice. It is nurtured by solidarity. But it is threatened by exclusion, systemic racism, and other injustices that must be uprooted. They will never just fade away. The increasing globalisation of markets is sharply focused on guarantees and protections for investors, but it has been blind to the same assurances for workers, for human rights, the environment, and social justice. The crisis has been aggravated by the extreme polarisation that has been created by authoritarians who define patriotism, not by what you are for, but by who you are against. They mobilise their mobs around fear, bigotry, and hatred, not around positive values or visions for the future. The conjunction of health, equality, and economic crises and the wave of political opportunism, disinformation, and manipulation have rendered more visible the fault lines of even the most robust democracies. On one side of the line is history, the past. The other side is starting right now. It's the future we are building. We have a foundation for action and reason for hope. Labour leader and rights activist Cesar Chavez said, "Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore." Colleagues, all around us, we see solidarity in the realisation that a decent future is built on community, not an assortment of individual interests and defence of the status quo. That good, functioning public services are more valuable than private gain. That decent lives for the people should be privileged over continued, unchecked accumulation by the few. There is understanding that there is only one world and that everyone is part of it. Both EI and PSI are fighting privatisation of public services. That is not just to defend the interests and well-being of our members or to provide good public services for our communities. It is also a fight for democracy. Public services must be tied to the will of the governed, and the common good must be defined by the public. Otherwise, the public good will be something for sale. Trade unions are about democracy. Unlike investors and corporations, we cannot thrive in dictatorships. Democracy is the air that we breathe. For the teaching profession, education is our vital contribution to stimulate critical thinking, to oppose segregation, and to build equity, diversity, and inclusion. Democratic values and competencies to construct a better present and future. The next few months and years are full of challenges, but also of opportunity. The last thing people want to rebuild their communities, and in some cases their lives, is a return to a normal that did not work. They do not need austerity programs that starve the present and sabotage the future. Instead, we need a sweeping change of priorities so that social justice is globalized and not just investment opportunities. We are gathered together today, PSI and EI, to enhance global trade union solidarity for strong public services, for fairer societies, and to defend and enhance democracy. In a mobilization for a better world, we are an essential and critical force for democracy, social justice, and peace. I'd like to now introduce and hand over the mic to David Prentice, the President of Public Services International and General Secretary of Unasyn in the United Kingdom. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Susan. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you, David.
That's great. And hopefully you can see me as well. And I'd like to thank you, Susan, for opening what I think is a really important conference on democracy and social justice, things that we fight for through our trade unions over many, many years. And as president of PSI, I too extend a warm welcome to all of PSI and EI leaders. And I would like to express my pride that the two major global union federations representing public service workers across the globe are now working together on the vital issues of democracy, public services, and the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic for us has exposed two things. First, the destructive impact of years of privatization and austerity on the ability of public services, and especially health and social care services, to respond immediately to the virus. But secondly, it has exposed also the failure of populist governments around the world to meet that challenge and to take our societies forward. We in PSI have prioritised the impact of COVID-19 on healthcare systems and on healthcare workers who have been the front line of our response. We have worked globally, seeking to influence the World Health Organization, and regionally, seeking to give direct help to our affiliates. Unfortunately, in many parts of our world, the lessons from previous epidemics have not been learned. In Europe, many of those countries that have been hit worst, including my own, with over 50,000 deaths and probably far more than that. In Europe, many of our countries have seen 10 years of austerity, clamping down on public services and democracy. It's left vital public services with inadequate resources, including vital personal protection equipment, respirators, and medicine. And as the center of the pandemic has moved to the Americas, we are seeing the impact of the virus in countries already suffering from major social and economic inequality, privatization, and the degradation of public services. And PSI has major concerns about the ability of healthcare systems in Africa to cope as the virus shows signs of gaining ground in that continent. In the global north, in Europe and North America, COVID-19 has exposed a scandalous underinvestment in our social care sector. with horrifying stories emerging from residential homes for older people, even in my own country of the United Kingdom. In the UK, the initial failure to get adequate PPE to hospitals and care homes was the result of privatisation and the neglect of healthcare logistics. Delays put tens of thousands of health and social care workers at risk, and sadly, many have contracted the virus and have died. Many are members of my union, Unasyn, the public service union, with over 1 million public service workers in membership. Another lesson from the pandemic has been the failure of populist politicians to respond to the crisis. Across the world, from Russia, the US and Brazil, and in the UK, these leaders sought first to deny that COVID-19 was a serious threat. Then they applied half-hearted lockdown measures, and finally, they have been pushed to reopen their economies too quickly, leading to the threat of major spikes in infections and deaths. For Trump and Bolsonaro, even the act of wearing a mask in public is seen as a sign of weakness. But there have been more worrying developments from the populist right than just the wearing of masks. Trump has withdrawn funding from the World Health Organization and sought to create divisions just when we needed unity in the G7 and G20. Putin is using the pandemic to consolidate his power, with the referendum on presidential time limits already going through in Russia. Viktor Orban in Hungary has used emergency legislation to actually suspend Hungary's democratic arrangements. Bolsonaro in Brazil has denied the dangers of the virus and has gone through 3 health ministers in as many months as the virus overwhelms the country's healthcare system. And in the UK, as I mentioned, 50,000 deaths and growing. Government ministers and advisors have broken their own quarantine rules and given conflicting interpretations of guidance, undermining what had been a very high level of public support for the government's lockdown measures, and now risking a second wave of infections as social distancing breaks down. It is too early to tell whether the pandemic will consolidate the power of some populist leaders or expose their rhetoric, but this is a dangerous time for democracy. It is also a dangerous time for all of us who believe in that fairer society, which Susan spoke about, and who believe in public services. As countries move into recession, unless we are strong, global union federations representing public service workers, unless we are strong and work together in PSI and EI, it is our public services who will pay the price, whether it is in healthcare, social care, or education. We must work together to stand up for our public services and our members. If we don't, then we're allowing it to others to take the agenda, and we will always be fighting catch up. We've got to set out our agenda for that fairer society, for our public services, and make sure that people listen across the globe. I'd now like to hand back to Susan to chair the remainder of our conference. Susan.
Thanks very much, David. We have all been affected by COVID, and many of us know somebody who has fallen ill or died. As trade unionists, we are too aware that the burden has fallen heavily on frontline workers who have continued to work to serve the public. This has fallen mostly on doctors, nurses, care workers, and healthcare workers who have paid a terrible price under impossible circumstances, but also on the teachers, transport workers, waste workers, retail, and many others who have risked their lives at work to keep us safe. We will now have a moment's silence to remember the workers who have died. We owe it to all of them to make sure we learn the lessons and build a better world. Colleagues, I'd now like to introduce Randi Weingarten, who is an EI Executive Board member and also the President of the American Federation of Teachers. Randi will moderate the next two sessions. Welcome, Randi.
Sorry, Susan. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Dave. And thank you, all of the participants who are watching this in various different times in the world. But as far away as we all are, we are very, very connected in EI and PSI by this love of democracy, not in a abstract way, but in the understanding that it is what enables us to have the infrastructure of voice. And in some ways, before I start, I do want to, I just went back, Susan, to the book that you and Fred put together on this issue of democracy in a way by saying that we are not new to these battles, but in the last several months, because of the three crises that we have right now, crises that affect the entire world at this moment, I wanted to flip through that again in terms of those lessons that you have given all of us, and wanted to start with that. You know, in different, Susan and Dave, and I do want to say this is a first for PSI and EI to do this kind of conference together in terms of the understanding the what democracy does in our fight for social justice and equality. And I get to introduce a couple of very, very, very important speakers who will help us see this. But in the different countries around the world, we are experiencing three far-reaching and interconnected crises. And some of them may show up differently, but we need to understand not only COVID, but how it interacts and interconnects with the other two crises. Obviously, the health crisis caused by the COVID pandemic. Second, there's an economic crisis that has now gotten worse because of the COVID pandemic, but it was there, as Dave and Susan said before, it was there already because of the economic inequality that has disproportionately hit vulnerable people and shows up in all sorts of ways, including the rage at refugees. And then, of course, there is the political crisis. Whether you think about it as the crisis of human rights, or you think about it as the political crisis that has been talked about already. If you look at it, it takes the form of a justice movement. In the United States, and our next speaker will be talking about this some, there have been years and years and years of the protest movement against the killing of unarmed Black men. And yet this time, after the murder by police of George Floyd, something has changed, something has shifted in the entire communities, majority communities, taking on that issue of how to try and fight for comprehensive, systematic reform of policing. All of these crises in the United States are made worse by the kind of leadership that is in the White House. Leadership like one sees in Hungary, like one sees in Brazil, like one sees in the Philippines. Leadership that just yesterday tweeted a video of people screaming white power. It's leadership that is both racist, but also incompetent and narcissistic. So how are these three connected? I think I've tried to make some of it clear. They disproportionately impact people, communities of color in the United States and across the global north, and now beginning to take a heavy toll on Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It's exacerbated the inequalities that already left millions of poor and working people struggling to survive. And even before the pandemic hit, 40% of families in the United States couldn't cover a small emergency expense. Now many are struggling just to feed their families, meet their basic needs, and feel safe in their own communities. And that is happening across the world as well. And so the connection between all of these run very deep, not only in the United States, but in every country that is represented on this. Think about it. While the American Revolution established the first modern democracy, it was the original sin of denying freedom and citizenship to Africans brought to our shore in change in the early 1600s. The struggle to fully achieve the promise of American democracy, that all are equal with rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, has been inseparable from the African American freedom struggle. And now, for the first time, probably in all the generations that I have been alive, now people see these two things as inseparable, at least in the United States. At least a majority see it now. When American democracy has become a more perfect union at the moments that it has, whether it was in Reconstruction, whether it was in the Civil Rights Movement, and hopefully right now, we see and saw a huge backlash. What we're trying to do now in America is, between protest and elections, really try and fight for that more perfect union. There are huge obstacles to it all across the world. Austerity, as Dave said, will be one of those new obstacles rearing its head again. The illiberal, the lack of vitality in democracy in so many places will be another. But let's be clear, these protest movements that have happened on the streets, whether it was the Arab Spring, whether it is this protest right now, whether it is the protest for environmental justice, they are absolutely essential as elections in trying to nurture the fight for democracy and the fight for justice. And our unions are central to those protests as well as central to those elections. We have another book that I wanted to raise, Democracy in Chains by Nancy McNeil. She talks about how we see the undergirding of democracy. We have another book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You know, of course, I'm a teacher, so of course I'm going to show off some books by Ibram Kendi. talking about how to recognize what it means to be anti-racist. We as unionists, we as teachers, we can actually show what it means, have the education background in terms of how we deal with all of these, the context of how we deal with these struggles. And ultimately, that's part of why we're doing this forum today. And what I would like to do is introduce our first keynote speaker, who frankly, in some ways needs no introduction, but because he is singular right now in the world in terms of his knowledge, his expertise, his activism in the work that all of us are doing. I not only call him a friend, I call him my teacher, and that is Reverend Al Sharpton. Reverend Sharpton has been for decades, for generations, for as long as I can remember, a leader in not only a protest movement, but a justice movement. Reverend Sharpton is the head of the National Action Network. He grew up in New York. You see him often on MSNBC, where he has his own show. But most importantly, in terms of Reverend Sharpton, is that he has understood the intersection between public pressure, public information, the press, advocacy, and elections, and understands how to move the work in a way that does bend the arc towards justice. But what he also does is he is there for people. He is there for the Floyd family. He's there for Rashard Brooks. He was there for Trayvon. He's there for Amadou. He's there for Abner. He's there for Eric Gardner. If you say their names, and if you see people who need and fight for justice, and many times feel so alone, Reverend Sharpton is there, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, in this fight for justice, whether it is convenient or whether it is inconvenient. And it is really my honor to introduce Reverend Al Sharpton.
Thank you, Randi Weingarten. And let me say at the outset that Randi and I have fought together on many of these issues for decades, and I consider her as much my sister as a co-laborer in the struggle for justice. Let me say I'm honored to have been invited to address such a unique and important gathering, because we're at a unique and a singularly important time in the history of all of our countries and in our lifetimes. What COVID-19 has done on a global level is brought to the front, to the forefront, what has always been there but was being easily ignored and in many cases intentionally marginalized. And that is the class and racial disparities when it comes to health services and when it comes to those on the front line that have now been called to be the ones that are the necessary and vital people that make these countries run, the essential workers. And when we look at the fact that this virus went across all racial and national and economic boundaries and began infecting everyone, the fact that it infected those that were poor, those that were of color at a larger rate is because the health services that they are in the environments of being desperately neglected reflected that those lack of services, that is, of course, the resulting lack of the proper health and makes you more vulnerable, it came home and it became apparent to everyone that these disparities was something that could not be ignored in the face of this pandemic. When we also looked at the essential workers, they also were the ones that were the majority, of course, those of lower income, those of color, that were the ones that not only had the highest rates of the coronavirus, they were the ones that had to take the riskier work of going out on the front lines and confronting, keeping these municipalities, these nations operating, even in the midst of a pandemic. So it is, to me, the height of irony. They have to call them essential workers because no one considered them essential when it was time to negotiate their contracts. And no one factored in they were essential when it was time to talk about their living conditions. And no one called them essential that they had to have their health protected when we distribute health services in the communities that they live in and raise their children in. But all of a sudden, in the panic of the pandemic, they are finally labeled essential. They've always been essential, but they have been essentially overlooked. In that framework, we come to what has happened in the United States. The killing and the murder by police of George Floyd is the case in point I will use to illustrate my point to you this morning. And that is that what happened to George Floyd became graphic and became clear in the living rooms or the places that people watch for their news all over the world. But unfortunately, it is not in and of itself particularly unusual in America. What do I mean by that? When I received the call from George Floyd's family attorney, Attorney Ben Crump, who has handled many of these cases, and said, Reverend Al, this is what happened. A police officer in Minneapolis put his knee on a handcuffed civilian for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and led to his death. And you might have seen it, but we need a continuing movement on this, and we need you to come in and highlight it. And the family would like to talk to you. And I did then speak to the family by phone. The first thing I did after talking to them was call a lady named Gwen Carr. And Gwen Carr was the mother of a young man named Eric Garner. Eric Garner, 6 years before George Floyd, had been in front of a little series of stores, a block of stores in the Staten Island section of New York. And they say he was selling Lucy cigarettes. Got into an encounter with the police, and the New York police, one of them grabbed him and put him in a chokehold blocking his breathing by having his arm around his throat. And George Floyd reminded me of this because Eric Garner, and it was caught on tape just like Floyd, there was a young man there in proximity to the incident with Eric Garner, videotaped the whole thing, and you could count 11 times Eric Garner said, "I can't breathe." When I heard the story of George Floyd a little over a month ago now, he said the same thing, "I can't breathe." So I couldn't help but call Gwen Clark to say, I'm going to Minneapolis, been asked by the family and the family attorney to go. Would you accompany me? And she agreed hurriedly because I wanted to demonstrate to them in the global news media that maybe if we had given some justice to Eric Garner, maybe we wouldn't have had a George Floyd, because those police officers may have known, if it was not the morally outrageous thing to do, that at least they knew there was the possibility of punishment. The fact of the matter is that the police officer that choked Eric Garner to death not only was never prosecuted, it took us 5 years to even get him fired from the police department. 5 years. So as Gwen Carr accompanied me to Minneapolis for the first rally. Hello?
We need everybody to mute their phones.
Oh,
if
okay.
you may. Sorry, Rev. I think somebody's.
That's all right. As she accompanied me to Minneapolis for the first rally and then later for the funeral, it was to say it was that breakdown in criminal justice in terms of being fair that I wanted to highlight here, because it is not about being anti-police, it is about being anti-injustice. The irony is that there was a New York City Police Department policy against chokeholds, never enforced it. We had, after the Eric Garner killing, proposed the state legislature and the city council of New York to have it as illegal, not just policies, but law against chokeholds. Never moved forward. In the aftermath of George Floyd, we now have a state law and a proposed federal law. The state law is already passed and signed. One of the things that I think happened in the pandemic is that with everyone being sheltered in, with everyone having to be in their homes, with no distractions of sports, you couldn't watch basketball or baseball or football or volleyball, everyone watching basically news, because we all were watching it night and day, hoping some glimmer of hope would come that we could come out of shelter and come out of having to stay home. And in the middle of that unprecedented attention of all people around the world, we see the George Floyd tape, and we see it over and over and over again. Now, I'll remind you, 10 days, 2 weeks before that, we saw a young man jogging in Brunswick, Georgia, named Ahmaud Arbery. He was shot down and killed on videotape in Brunswick, Georgia. So that preceded it. Breonna Taylor, young woman in her home. Police in Louisville, Kentucky are looking for some suspect. They used the no-knock law and break into her house with no warning. Her boyfriend, who's there asleep with her, thinks they're being robbed. He takes a legal weapon and shoots toward the police. They follow with 20 rounds of firing their guns, kills Breonna Taylor in her own home, only to find they had the wrong address and the suspect they were looking for was already in custody. All of this we saw while we were sheltered down. George Floyd became the last of those three, and people just had enough. And in the midst of the pandemic, people started pouring into the streets protesting, because many saw for the first time that they paid attention. Others because they just never saw how brutal it was. They started pouring out, joining the ranks that many of us have had to deal with for a long time. In the midst of that, we've got to deal with the class as well as the race problem, and we have to structure movements that will alleviate and lead to solving the problems. Otherwise, we will end up with people fired up for a moment or a month or 2 months and not dealing with long-term sustained indignation that leads to real change. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, as Randi said, but I became very young. I started preaching as a youngster, and very young I became part of Operation Breadbasket, the economic arm of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the fact is that the North was not a place, Northern United States, that many were in the Black community at that time was moving toward Dr. King. They were moving toward more what they would call at the time militant factions. And because I grew up in the church and I was of the church, my mother wanted me to stay in the church and guided me to the King movement. I, at 13 years old, became the youth director of that chapter in New York, and it was the same year Dr. King was killed. So I only saw him twice, but I was mentored and raised by some of his lieutenants. And one of the things that they taught me is Dr. King always said that there are two types of leaders. There are transactional leaders and transformational leaders. Transactional leaders trade, make deals, arrange, exchange this for that, leverage this for that. Transformational leaders don't necessarily transact business. They create the climate under which business occurs. Another way King would put it is that there are thermometer leaders and there are thermostat leaders. Thermometer leaders judges the temperature in a given area or room, and the thermostat leaders change the temperature in the room. They turn the heat up or they turn it down. So I came out of the transformational thermostat form of leadership. If it had not been for those thermostats, we would never have ended slavery. It was the abolitionists who set the climate that finally led some of the Union Army to tell Abe Lincoln, you've got to free some of the slaves in the slave states to join the Union Army or we're going to be defeated by the Confederates. The climate was set by them. The same after Reconstruction when the NAACP was founded in Niagara Falls during the era of lynching. The same with Marshall, Thurgood Marshall in the 54 Brown versus Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court, and a year later Rosa Parks sitting on the bus and students and others taking the interstate travel. All of this was done by people that did the work on the ground that changed the temperature. The one constant was, if you deal with those movements I've cited in the United States, or if you deal with it around the world, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in Africa, particularly the struggles against apartheid in South Africa, whether it's South America, Central America, there was always this marriage of labor unions and those that were fighting for justice, whether it was on racism or economic questions. Example and point is that 2 months from now, Martin Luther King III and I have called a march on Washington, reminiscent of the 57 years ago when Martin Luther King had the march on Washington to where he made his speech, I Have a Dream. And the march is around police reform. We're doing this year police reform and around voting rights, which is in serious jeopardy in the United States. What most people don't know, that I will remind them that day, is the march in 1963, 57 years ago, was not called by Martin Luther King. It was called by A. Philip Randolph. And had Randolph not called and gotten labor to provide the troops and resources, we would have never seen that march. And we would have never heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. It was the combination of those activists and labor that would provide structure and resources and vision that sustained a movement that the 63 March on Washington helped directly to lead to the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. So what we are appealing to you today, and what I hope this unusual and needed forum of you type of leaders will produce, is we must not look as tourists at those of us that are in the street and those young people, the new generation. We must join them and help structure them and teach them the history of these movements is that labor was always not an add-on, but part of the foundation, because if labor does not stand up for the laborers, then what is the function of labor? If labor doesn't understand that it is not by the manicured guys in the penthouse, but it is by the people who get the dirt under their nails and work and provide everything from education to infrastructure building, that are the ones that they represent and that they're fighting for. We have a tremendous amount of stressful and unparalleled living going on around the world because of COVID, because of economic insecurity. It also gives those of us that have vision and those of us that know how to organize the opportunity in this time to rearrange a lot of things that we could not arrange or rearrange before because people were not paying attention. And now they're forced to pay attention because of their circumstances, not because of our talents and gifts. Coupled with that is that around the world, whether it is in Brazil, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Great Britain, we have people that have become heads of states that are antithetical to the interests of those people and do it in an arrogant way. As I speak, just an hour and a half ago, I was on MSNBC talking about how the President of the United States retweeted this videotape of a man with a Trump hat on or Trump paraphernalia, white power in Florida yesterday. I remember Reverend Y.T. Walker, who was executive director of Martin Luther King. He became the first chairman of the board of our organization, National Action Network. He told me one day talking, he said, you know, Al, when we were fighting in the South, when you were just a little kid, he said, and we went to Albany, Georgia, and Dr. King was going to use that as a case in point to fight segregation as his second big battleground after Montgomery. The police chief there treated us so courteous, wouldn't arrest us, that we couldn't get a movement off, and we left embarrassed. So we combed the South looking for who would fight us, because we needed a clear opponent to show what the brutality and the lack of human rights that the whole question of segregation and Jim Crow represented. And we chose Birmingham because the police chief there was Bull Connor, who we knew would fight us. And sure enough, he did. He put fire hoses on children demonstrating. He sicked dogs on us. And it was the drama of that no one could deny it was racism and bigotry. And the debate was on whether we were going to continue with this or change. And that helped us dramatize a movement that changed American law. I'm saying that whether it is Donald Trump in the United States or whether it is those in Brazil or UK or wherever, they are in many ways just as inflexible and just as arrogant, even though they may not be as caustic as Bull Connor. And in some ways they are. If we can't organize with clear opponents to human rights and human dignity, then we need to forfeit whatever roles we have in whatever institutions we represent and have others come on because we're incompetent. You cannot look at these people who are unabashedly representing what is against the interests of the people that we contend that we lead and not be able to mobilize now. We must be able to maturely mobilize, work with these young activists, work together across racial and national lines, because this is an idea whose time has come. It could not be clearer. It could not be more of a need for it. And it could not be anyone other than us that is in this conference call. If we're not going to do it, who's going to do it? And the people are screaming for structure and for continuity and for those that know better to help us do better. And my challenge to you is that we must step in if we're not already there and we must make sure that we not only have a great 1 or 2 innings, but we win this game. And that's going to take some perseverance, some endurance, and real commitment. And I would hope, on behalf of those that we have fought for, that you and I and others will rise to the occasion. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend. And I think people see why, I hope people see why I call the Rev my teacher, even though we have marched together in so many ways, and why I call him singular at this moment of time. I don't know if you have any time for a couple of questions, Rev. I know that your time is very limited today, and we really, really, really appreciate you being with us. I'm trying to see if the Reverend is still on. He may not be. He may have had to go. But if he's still on, let me just hear. If not, we'll take those words and those moments and we'll go on to, we are, by the way, will be one of the groups that obviously help in the march this August, not only to commemorate the March on Washington, but really to focus on both justice issues and long-term election issues. We need to win this election, and this notion of having protest and politics to ultimately change things is something that labor and this group of unions understand all throughout the world. I think I would just, one of the things that I think is different at this moment than we've seen before is that we clearly, the dictators around the world would use the health crisis and the economic crisis as a pretext for imposing even more authoritarian rule. And they would use it as a pretext to further suppress unions and repress racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities. You see that around the world, and you see what Trump in the United States attempted to do almost immediately in terms of this notion of of taking a Bull Connor type statement about shooting and killing and then tear gassing peaceful protesters and saying that he was going to stay in Washington this weekend to try to protect the quote unquote historical monuments. So all of these things that, you know, the monuments of Confederacy, he attempted that same playbook of Bolsonaro, of Orban, of Putin, of Duarte. But the protests have been a way of not only mitigating, but overtaking it and changing that narrative. But the long-term message of Reverend Sharpton is something that we as unions all across the country, and we in terms of our infrastructure, can really, really help as we have over the course of generations. It is very important to be part of and to help with infrastructure and help protesters in this moment of time, but also to try, to the extent possible, create the kind of coalitions that are necessary to change who is governing and not allow these authoritarians to use this moment to actually impose more authoritarian rule. With that, I want to actually just ask our other keynoter to be ready to talk to us, and that's Mariana Mazzucato. I hope I pronounced her name right, and my apologies if I did not. She is professor of economics at the University College of London, where she is the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I see her on the screen now. She is the author of The Entrepreneurial State and the Value of Everything. And Professor Mazzucato will speak to us today about the powerful myths that are designed to minimize the role of government and the importance, obviously, of what we all do every day, the public goods and public services. And she will talk about the powerful economic forces that have worked to convince public opinion that government, not economic inequality or social injustice, is the problem. And that, just like Reagan did in America, that the starvation of resources and the politics of austerity and privatization should be the solution. We all know that that is not true, but what has happened, and the professor will say it far better than I, that these efforts have undermined public confidence in democracy and public confidence in government. And she will make clear just how intentional this argument has been over the course of time. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, I think there was a misunderstanding on the time. I was supposed to finish at this time because I have another talk. So I will speak for the 12 minutes and hopefully I'll have time to answer some of the questions because that's, of course, what this is all about. And thank you so much for inviting me, and especially after the inspirational speech we just heard from Reverend Al Sharpton. And I loved what he said about moving from transactional to transformational, because in fact that really kind of pivots very well to what I'd like to talk about, which is that it is absolutely impossible to fix our way out of not only this crisis, but as you rightly said in the beginning, the multiple crises that are actually happening in parallel. The climate crisis, the economic crisis, we still have not recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. And that to a large extent has been because both in the climate case and on the environmental case, we have pretended that we can just fix our way out of it, that we have to actually wait for massive problems, what economists would call market failures, to actually then justify any sort of public action. And when there is then public action, we always have to be worried that it's not too much because it might actually crowd out business initiative. These are, again, very boring words that economists like to use, the term crowding out. And again, I loved how Al Sharpton said that a transformational agenda is actually changing the climate within which business even occurs, and how we rethink the contracts, how we think the need actually to create a vision which then shapes and creates the kind of economy and society that we get, as opposed to pretending that that just happens in the business community and everyone else is just fixing, enabling, or regulating their way to a better economy. So anyway, thank you again. And what every speaker I think has said so far, you've alluded to this word of essential workers. In the UK, we call them key workers. And what I would like to see, and we see it in some places, so part of what I'll talk about is also some interesting things that are happening around the world where the conversation seems to have moved on. But really what we need is a question and an answer to what does it mean to value key workers and essential workers, but especially transform that concept into an essential economy, an essential society. How do we fund, resource, rethink, reimagine those essential institutions where essential workers work? And in some ways, to a large extent, this is, I think, also about reimagining the welfare state itself. In the UK, where I'm sitting, of course, it was the Beveridge report that set up the welfare state. And I think this is absolutely a time to value the welfare state, but at the same time to be reimagining those very services. And one of the big problems within economics, where I work, I'm an economist, is we literally do not know how to value most public services. I'm sure many of you know this, but just in case some don't, economics basically confuses price with value. So we only put into GDP those services that have a marketed price. So if you marry your babysitter, GDP will actually go down. if you pollute, GDP will go up. And I'm sort of being facetious there, but that's just to explain how awkward this measure is, which, you know, if you pollute, someone's got to clean it up, and cleaning up the pollution, it makes it go up. And that kind of, you know, joke about marrying your babysitter, the reason that is we don't know how to value care that's actually done within our homes, whether that's caring for the elderly, caring for children. Only we know how to value it when we're actually paying for it. And public services, which of course we pay for in terms of the input, right? So there's salaries of school teachers, salaries of nurses if they're working in a public health program. We don't know how to value the output. And so the irony is we only look at the spend. We look at the costs, you know, the words, the cost, the spend, the debt, that, you know, how much does it cost? We still haven't figured out how to actually measure what is the value that's being created by a well-structured, well-resourced, I'll come back to the word reimagine, because we need vision. I love how Al Sharpton kept talking about vision. We need vision in our health services. And do we even know how to value whether a particular service is being resourced properly and the value that's being created? And the answer is no. And that's, by the way, why there's so much talk often about cutting the cost, because we only know how to measure the cost. We don't know how to measure the value. And also, if you don't have a vision of the state itself, where many of these public services are housed, actually all of them, if you only think about the state at best as fixing a market failure, as enabling, as de-risking the private sector, or facilitating, or kind of funding the basic things like education, the roads and the bridges, and then all the value creation happens somewhere else, there also becomes less of a justification for why you should even be spending and investing in the dynamic capabilities of the state institutions themselves. So what we've also witnessed hasn't just been the privatization kind of crisis and the outsourcing trend, but also a fall in the actual investments and the dynamic capabilities of different types of public institutions. And so in some ways, even though outsourcing and privatization, one could argue, have been fueled by ideology, let's just call it the neoliberal kind of, you know, Washington consensus ideology, it has ironically in some countries also become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't believe that public services are actively creating value, they're just kind of doing the background stuff and all the value is done in business, then there's no real reason that you should be thinking about what are the capabilities, the knowledge, the innovation that's required within those same services in order to be value creating. And, you know, speak to any CEO or manager or person in the private sector who thinks that they're creating value, they'll brag about the great training they get, the great business schools they go to study these funky courses called strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. And then you look at the kind of training that we provide literally at the curriculum level. So I often say we need to change the education system itself for the training of dynamic, you know, public service workers. You don't get even that language. There isn't the kind of, you know, also, you know, explicit recognition. I am a value creator. I work in a value creating institution, and hence I need to ask all sorts of questions about how that value can be created over time in terms of the capabilities, the dynamic capabilities themselves that the public sector needs. So anyway, that under-resourcing problem is not just about austerity. It's much more deep in terms of almost cutting off the bloodline, and, you know, teachers having actually to pay in many cases for their own training because that training is not coming from the system itself. And when I say that, you know, the state unfortunately has been put in this position of just seeing as a fixer, then the question is, well, then how should we talk about it? And I've already mentioned this notion of market shaping and co-creating, not just fixing. And the question is, what does that then actually mean? And, you know, a lot of my work has actually even just been historical. My book, The Entrepreneurial State, which you kindly mentioned in the introduction, was all about how Silicon Valley itself in the US, which continues to be this kind of model that many countries in both the developed world and the developing world talk about when they look at, you know, innovation and the power of the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks. Even though we all know they're a bit problematic, we still think they're really entrepreneurial. And none of that innovation would have actually occurred without state investments in both the basic research from organizations like the National Science Foundation, but also the downstream research and actually allowing the internet itself, which was funded by the state sector, even its own commercialization came from state institutions. And in many developing countries, for example, without active public banks and patient finance coming from the state, we wouldn't actually be having even some of the most innovative companies, because what innovative companies need is not inpatient finance, but patient, long-term committed finance, which historically has actually come from different types of state bodies. This doesn't mean, by the way, that any of these state institutions are always important. They have to be shaped. They need proper remits. And I often look at the BBC, by the way, as a really interesting public service in the UK, because they've had this really dynamic discussion internally about what they're for, right? And they specifically talk about public value, one word which is missing in economics. We talk about things like the public good in economics, but that's always the correction for something that the private sector is not doing. It's not really an objective. And one of the interesting things about the BBC is they sell themselves precisely as Reverend Al Sharpton was talking about, in terms of transforming people's experiences with public television and changing the landscape, not just fixing an internal one, an existing one. Then they dared to go into areas which traditionally we're not seeing for public broadcasting. So the traditional public broadcasting area would be kind of high quality news, like in the US, and NPR, or documentaries about areas that might be seen as sort of less commercially oriented. And actually what the BBC did was say, whatever, we're going to do everything. We're going to do talk shows, we're going to do soap operas, but we're going to do it through a lens of a citizen's focus, really kind of transforming what it even means to do a soap opera. So EastEnders about the working class, not just Dallas about the 1% in the US. And that might sound maybe irrelevant, but it's not. It means that the state, through an internal discussion of what it's for, public purpose, public value, daring to go into areas that it's being told not to because it might crowd out business, but in doing so, by having a vision, actually creating a whole new landscape, which then crowds in business, right? Business actually follows. The state leads, business follows. So I could say more about that, but I won't. This market shaping agenda right now under COVID is essential. There's many areas that are receiving, in fact, public funding, but it's not enough. It's not enough to throw money at a vaccine, for example, unless you govern that process through a market shaping lens. And by governing it through a public value, public purpose lens, it means you have to make sure that all the money going in actually produces a universal access to the vaccines, and also that they're for free. And this has been a huge failure, by the way, in worldwide health innovation, where even in the US, I think the government spends $40 billion a year on health innovation. And then that money is not represented in the prices of the drugs. So taxpayers are paying 2 or 3 times. And then the patent system, the intellectual property rights system, is allowed to be abused. So patents are too strong, they're too wide, they're too upstream, they actually block innovation. So that's the state misgoverning, in some ways, its finance. And we cannot risk this, for sure, with vaccines today. But also, if you think about the digital divide, I've got 4 children, they're at home, but they obviously have access to the internet and to all sorts of things that many people with lower social and economic access don't have. And that's, again, a failure of governance. Most of the digital technologies that we all have access to were actually, again, state funded. The fact the state has not been an active shaper of what we might call platform capitalism and digital technologies is a failure. And in countries like Spain have actually been thinking about this in very creative ways. So the mayor of Barcelona in recent years, she said, we need to make sure that when citizens are accessing technologies like Citymapper, that produces data. We need to find a way for that data then to improve public transport, not just to go inside, private companies then can market that data. And that required the city of Barcelona to hire their own hacking team and create this wonderful project. If you're interested in it, it's called Decode. But anyway, what I'm saying is, to shape and govern in the interest of the public, you also sometimes need new institutions, definitely new contracts, but also new structures. And that example in Spain was very interesting, where they thought about, we actually need a new kind of public governance and commons, a public commons view of the data that didn't exist. And lastly, what we're seeing now with all this money that's really being poured in last minute, kind of too little too late, or actually a lot too late into the COVID crisis, unless you govern that in terms of a new kind of social compact between trade unions, business, and government, then the outcome actually can be quite bad and simply set up another crisis. And so again, this issue of making sure that there's strong conditionalities attached to the bailout schemes that many sectors are getting, whether it's airlines that aren't flying, making sure that those conditions are based on better work conditions for workers, better pay, better work structures that we know are just so precarious, with the zero-hour contracts having fueled the gravity in some ways of the crisis itself, but also, of course, the carbon commitment. So it was quite striking in the UK, EasyJet just said, just give us the money, no conditions attached, and the UK government kind of caved in, whereas in France, Air France was not allowed to get any money unless they committed to carbon reductions, or in Denmark, the bailouts were not given to companies that did not, were using tax havens. And Elizabeth Warren in the US has been arguing that bailouts should not be given to companies that are extracting too much value, as opposed to reinvesting those profits back into production, worker training programs, et cetera. So, I mean, trade unions, I'll just finish with this because I'm already over time. Trade unions are absolutely fundamental in making sure that we get this governance structure right. We need to change how we think about the market itself. Markets are outcomes of how we govern our system. So if we misgovern it, we get a particular type of market outcome. And without trade unions, we wouldn't have weekends, we wouldn't have 8-hour workdays. That helped to form the kind of market we have today. So making sure that we have a worker's voice at the table, ex ante, not just ex post, even framing what we mean by a green transition, a just transition, and especially today with the COVID crisis, a transition to a healthier, more sustainable and inclusive economy. That's fundamental. And there's an opportunity to do that because, not just because of the crisis we're living through and that it's just absolutely needed, but all the talk up until January was that we needed stakeholder governance of companies. There was 180 CEOs who met in September 2019 and basically said, we've lost our way, we've just been maximizing shareholder returns, we need a new form of capitalism. In Davos this year, where lots of these CEOs meet, in Switzerland, that was the talk of the town. This is the moment to test that talk, to make sure that we walk it, and really thinking through how to bring workers' voices and movements, that emphasis on the movements that everyone was talking about before, to the table now in order to make sure we structure the recovery in a way that produces a more inclusive, more sustainable, less racist, more equal economy. That's essential. And it's never historically happened on its own. It's always happened through movements and people who fought for social justice. And we need to use the word of stakeholder governance to make sure that then we call the bluff on all the talk about that. And I do think this is the moment because, as everyone has said, this crisis has exposed extreme weaknesses in the structure, the underlying structure of our economy. And we need to talk about things like how do we value this essential part of our economy in fundamentally different ways, but especially bringing new voices to the table to reimagine it. And I apologize, I've gone over by 3 minutes.
We are so grateful that I know you have a hard, I know you have a hard stop. Do you have a moment for questions or do you have a hard stop?
Absolutely.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you so much.
About 7 minutes, if that's okay.
Thank you. I love a speaker who tells us exactly what they have, and what they can do. Thank you. Let me ask Dave, do we have any questions from the chat?
Thanks, Randi. We have a couple of questions, and I think in some ways Professor Mazzucato has touched on some of them, so perhaps the questions are really to ask her to elaborate further. The first is, how do we push back against these myths about the role of the state? It does seem that there is a vicious circle where the media and many of the voices in our economy are private and dominate these debates, and they use that to reinforce the myths, which then reinforces their own position. So how do we break that cycle? And I think Professor Mazzucato mentioned a little bit about bailout conditions, but perhaps there are some other examples. And then the second question that we have is, how do we challenge these myths in the international institutions? So the IMF or the World Bank or the OECD, where public sector unions, PSI and EI all operate, where these debates are sometimes a little bit removed from the experiences of workers on the ground. So they're the two things I think people would like to elaborate more on. One is, how do we get into the debate to challenge these myths? And two is, how do we do that in the international institutions?
Okay, well, thank you. Two really great questions. On the first one, let me just make sure you can hear me. On the first one, I mean, there's two different issues. One is just kind of the facts. I mean, we need better marketing, better storytelling. Plato, the famous, Greek philosopher, said storytellers rule the world. Unfortunately, he was right, but the wrong stories are being told. So that point I made about Silicon Valley, it's not just Silicon Valley. Most countries, especially in the developing world, that were able to develop through that trajectory, the kind of state they needed was a much more active, proactive one that actively co-created, didn't just fix. And so the more we can kind of talk about the concrete examples and let citizens even realize what they were, and realize that so much of the success that we pretend is on the back of private, solely private initiative, also required a massive social infrastructure and public sector workers and public funding. But the second point is, once you do that, the question is kind of, who cares? Is it just about storytelling? Is it just about getting the history books right? And the answer is absolutely not. If you have all this public money going in and being essential in creating value, the next question is, how can we make sure that we set up structures that ex ante, not just ex post, so before, not just after, embed literally in the social compact that collective value creation process. Let me just give you an example, because it's always through examples we can understand things better. In the US, the government gave both Tesla, you all probably know about the Tesla electric car, and Solyndra $500 million in a guaranteed loan. And that was really early stage finance that the private financial sector wasn't willing to give, because in most cases, private finance is actually risk averse. So in many different countries, it was, as I mentioned before, public finance that actually allowed things to kind of get off the ground. But what happened then, first of all, most Americans don't realize their money went to Tesla. They only know it went to Solyndra. Why? Because it failed. So we know always about the public sector failures, not many public sector successes. So that's the storytelling bit. But the second bit is what happened. Obama, thinking he was being super, bright, said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. So why would you want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back its loan? It doesn't make any sense. Had he said what he should say, what I think the state should do as an active investor, we get 3 million shares in your company if you're successful and pay back the loan. The price per share in Tesla between 2009 and 2013 went from 9 to 90. Multiply that difference by 3 million, that would have been more than enough money to cover the Solyndra loss and the next round. So the idea here is, how do you socialize not only risks, but also rewards? How can the public, meaning literally citizens and taxpayers, benefit and not just be asked to bail out the failures, but get an upside from the successes? And that requires thinking about things like public wealth funds, or a citizen's dividend, or a citizen's share. And even though I'm interested in UBI, universal basic income, one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of it is I don't like the narrative that it's just a handout. I think citizens, by admitting that workers and communities and citizens are collectively creating value, that it's not just the Elon Musks, of course Elon Musk is important, then we need to make sure that value is reinvested back into our communities, into our workplaces, but also that people who help create that value are invested in their capabilities, but literally an income share. And whereas UBI is seen as a handout, a check that's just kind of sent off, and that's seen as a handout from the wealth creators themselves who create wealth and the state gives out the money, reframing that narrative in terms of a citizen's dividend and a citizen's share would just be one example of how that story isn't just about telling the truth, the Tesla story, but also setting up new structures which capture that collective value creation. So I think the battle there is on twofold. One, the history telling, the storytelling, just how much success, even fracking and shale gas was state funded. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's really the transformational impact that the state has had. And second, getting new structures that make sure that citizens actually benefit. the international agencies, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, workers' voices and trade unions are often not at the table. I think what should be done now is, because both the IMF and the World Bank have in recent years woke up to how much they've failed. There's literally papers on their websites saying, whoops, we messed up, austerity doesn't work. We need to make sure that the counter to austerity isn't just this notion of shovel-ready projects. You know, okay, don't do austerity, fund the basic stuff. We need to say, it's not just about funding the basic stuff and then getting out of the way again. It's about what I was mentioning before, and I think Al Sharpton said so well, transforming our economies, asking about the public investments in the research, in the education, in the infrastructure, in the service design, in the dynamic capabilities of the public sector, so it's strengthened deep in the bones. The structures have to be stronger, more resilient. That's what we've learned, of course, from COVID. You can't just throw money at health in the emergency if we've decimated those very services for the last 20 years. So making sure that this kind of mea culpa moment within specifically some of the Washington consensus institutions translates into a structural transformational shift. I really hope that their trade unions are in the front line arguing for that. And I think you, especially with the public service angle, the more you can kind of repeat this issue, that it's kind of condescending to talk about essential workers without then strengthening those institutions, but those institutions themselves where public sector workers work need to be redesigned, they need to be reimagined, and workers' voices have to be at the table in doing that. It cannot be elites coming in, academics or CEOs at the Davos kind of areas talking about that. We need trade unions, workers' voices, and allowing us to reimagine the kind of state we need, and use this talk by the World Bank that they failed with austerity to become a moment that isn't just about helicopter money, but a real reinstitutional design with dynamic capabilities at the center and investing in people and places.
I want to say thank you to the professor for all of that, and our apologies for delaying you some. And I want to go to, so thank you very much for everything. I want to go to the next panel. I'm mindful of the time. And so we have 4 experts who are going to each talk for about 5 or 6 minutes about, where they have actually walked this walk, and they've actually been human rights and trade union rights defenders, and have paid a price for the resisting of either racism, autocracy, or economic deprivation. And the first one I'd like to bring up on this Zoom is my dear friend Mugwena Maluleke, who is the General Secretary of the South African Democratic Teachers Union and the Vice President of EI. And he can tell us about the experience of the South African trade unions in promoting equality and dignity and tackling institutionalized racism, both at home and abroad. Mugwena, would you share your thoughts, and also if you have any kind of thoughts about what our 2 keynotes have said? And thank you for everything, and it's nice to see you, my friend.
Thank you so much, my friend Randi. Let me also thank the EI and the PSI leadership represented by presidents today. Indeed, I wish to start with some few thoughts about our inspirational speakers today. That is Professor Mariana Mazzucato and Reverend Al Sharpton. First is to acknowledge the speech by the Reverend, that indeed it is very much important for us to continue to be educating and mobilizing, because as trade unionists and as trade union movement, Our power is in organizing, and our power is in mobilizing and educating our people to remain activists in defense of democracy and in the fight for social justice and equality. And I think I agree with him that the tweet by the President of the United States, where he tweeted on the white power, to me is a demonstration of a head of state who is racist, and to me that is fascism, and therefore that is what is facing our times today. And therefore raising the issues about the COVID-19 that has really demonstrated these levels of inequalities in the world, has exposed the pandemics that were already there before this particular pandemic. And indeed, I want to thank Professor Mariana for raising the most important part of labor being on the table, that all the time there must be a social compact where we are able to raise our voice about the bailouts that are given unconditional to business, which is about making profit. And as trade unionists and as labor, it is important that we are able to put those conditions. And I want to put it to you, Randi, my friend, that it is important that leaders, and especially governments, must recognize public service as one of the areas where these bailouts have got to be channeled to. Funding public service, funding public goods, funding public education, to me, it is the necessary bailout or a stimulus package that will guarantee sustainable development, sustainable economic recovery, and sustainable services in order to ensure our health system is built, our education system is built, our public transport and any other public service is built. So I want to thank them for raising those particular issues and talking about this transformational agenda that we need to be facing. My experience in South Africa, as we talk about how we can defend democracy, how we can ensure that we fight for social justice, is a history of a struggle that has been ongoing, where we were able as trade unions and trade union movement in our country to work with the liberation movement in ensuring that education plays a critical role in terms of power, giving power of knowledge to our fighters, our freedom fighters, in ensuring that they engage. Very critical, where we were using education policy unit to develop policies that had to change education system that was aimed at disempowering, aimed at underdeveloping, dehumanizing, and degrading. It was an education system that I want to link it with what is happening today in the United States and everywhere else about racism and about prejudice and hate. That is what is an education system that indeed was aimed at making sure that your dignity is really dealt with in such a way that you have to walk as a Black person with that particular sense of inferiority, that sense of not being listened to, that sense of that you don't matter, that your life doesn't matter, your health doesn't matter. That was the education system that we had to fight. And therefore, as part of being activists, as trade unionists, it was important. We could not be able to fight against a system of apartheid racism that was declared a crime against humanity alone. We needed alliances. We needed to work in solidarity with the social solidarity movement in the world, the anti-apartheid movement in the world, and many of the activists in the world had to come together and stand in solidarity with all of us to fight against that particular system that created violence in people. So if I remember the riots in 1960 of the Sharpeville, it reminds me of what is happening today in the United States of America after the murder of George Floyd. When I remember the 1976, the students who were unarmed and who were really fired and killed by the brutality of the police, it reminds me, and then it brings me closer home to then say, when people are fighting for justice, social justice, fighting for equality, fighting for them to be heard, and they're not being heard. They'll go into the streets, they will riot, they will protest, and therefore calling for them to be listened to. And I'm asking myself today that had there been no videos in the form of mobile phones, Randy, would have the world and the globe as a whole come together and say, Black Lives Matter. And the movement that started for some time in the United States of America today is a global movement that everybody is talking about. That if there were mobile phones in 1960, when 69 unarmed demonstrators were murdered by the brutality of the police, if there were mobile phones, I believe, Randy, that today we might have had apartheid being ended earlier than it had in 1994. I believe that had we had these videos that were watched by billions and billions in the world in 1976 for the killing of our students, I believe that apartheid would have ended early. And I want to center that to say it is important as trade unionists to unite, to ensure that we change the curriculum, as the two speakers have made it clear that indeed we need to educate, because educating about our love, educating about us anchoring ourselves and reflecting that we are equal, and therefore we've got to treat each other with respect, with compassion, and with empathy is very, very important. So for me today, I want to end my short response to the speakers by the centrality of education, that we need to indeed implement the resolution of EI in decolonizing education, in making sure that we bring closer home that importance of epistemologies of the indigenous people, of the native people, that they are important and their cultures are important. Because if we don't listen to each other, we will continue to have bigotry, to have hate, to have prejudice that are even endorsed by the leaders that we elect. So it's important that trade union movement today must not shy away from the political activities, from the elections, and making sure that the leaders we elect are the leaders that are not going to institutionalize dehumanization of our people, are not going to institutionalize racism and building cages, Randy, where they put children. And therefore the world had to respond, and we have to feel outraged by those kind of leaders in the world. So I want to say the education is very, very important, and therefore we need to continue to unite our organization globally as the workers to make sure that we're in the table. When the WTO is meeting, we need to be influential. When the IMF makes decision, they need to listen to the people who are working in the public service. Finally, we have our pension fund. We have to use the strength that we have. $5 trillion that we control as labor, as public service. It is what drives our economy, and therefore we need to be able to direct that our democracy need to be defended, that we fight for a social justice, we fight for an equal economy in the world. So I thank you, and thank you so much, and I thank the speakers for really having been able to channel us into this particular energy that we need today to fight and ensure that indeed racism is something that we must fight everywhere, and hate is what we have got to uneducate and educate for peace and for love and for compassion and for kindness. So I thank you, Randy.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, Mugwena. And I think you and I'm going to introduce Annie in about 30 seconds. But I think your the focus that you just had on making sure that kids matter and that kids of color don't see themselves mattering, and the transparency that in some ways you also saw with what happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the fact that there were cameras and there were photographers that could see what police and the state troopers were doing to John Lewis, created a sense of outrage that people could not look away. So thank you for those two interventions and the importance of being in the table.
and the importance of education. With that, we have three other commentators from our union movement. I'd like to introduce Annie Enriquez Geron. And Annie is the elected president of Public Service Independent Confederation, PS Link, and the vice president of PSI. Annie is from the Philippines, where all of us know that Duarte is in the same league as Bolsonaro, Orban, and Trump. And I would actually, we pray for you, Annie, and we ask you to tell us about the forces that led Duarte to being elected, and what can we do to help you, because the union movement in the Philippines is resisting every single day to his attack on democratic institutions. But thank you.
Thank you, Randi, and greetings, solidarity greetings to all comrades in PSI and EI and all those who are participating in this very important conference. I'd like to start my brief contribution to this conference by recognizing that globally, countries ravaged by COVID-19 struggle to withstand its unprecedented toll to healthcare and socioeconomic system. The pandemic laid bare the weaknesses of public governance system in health and other areas in both developed and developing countries, as governments strive to respond to a humanitarian crisis that has now unfolded. While the pandemic indiscriminately affects all countries, its negative impact is disproportionately heavier in countries such as the Philippines. The pandemic has further laid bare the fault lines of inequality, as the life of the poor, vulnerable, and socially excluded are expected to exponentially deteriorate. So country contexts do shape health outcomes. It is the complementation of multiple development factors that determine the nation's health. Improvement in the health sector account for only 20% of change in health status, while improvements in the social condition account for larger 80%. So it is therefore imperative that the analysis and understanding of the pandemic situation include not only of the disease, but also the social determinants of health, namely access to safe and potable drinking water and sanitation, food security and nutrition, decent housing, decent work, with safe conditions, conducive environment, working condition, public transport and road safety, access to health-related education and information, safe space for all genders, culturally responsive economic and social services, peace in the community, and last but not the least, very important, democracy and freedom. Prior to COVID-19, democracy around the world has been challenged and under attack. And according to Freedom House, 64 countries became less democratic and only 37 became more so since 2006. In the Philippines, we see this condition as fast-shrinking democratic space. Globally also, both dictatorship and democracies have imposed draconian measures as primary form of COVID response, resulting to the curtailment of civil liberties on a massive scale. The pandemic has legitimized the use of armed forces in health response. So civic space is now a controlled territory. So the struggle for a new world order is heightened by the pandemic, and the contest of change narrative is already upon us. For example, globalization versus national development, brown versus green economy, small government versus big, subsidy versus free market, and authoritarianism versus democracy. So in the Philippines, democracy is greatly tarnished by the failures of neoliberal democracy. The economic and political dichotomy of the powerful rich and the powerless poor, and the decades-long policies that greatly weaken and systematically dismantle public services, all of these made Duterte's populist, messianic rhetorics and quick fix promises attractive to voters. the protest vote against the ruling elite hugely paid for the way to Duterte's election as president. So it's not surprising, really, that Duterte equated COVID-19 pandemic to terrorist attack, which he exploited in order to consolidate power. And in the interest of expeditious response, he sought the enactment of Bayanihan Hill One Act, which set aside all checks and balances, decimate with intention to dissolve opposition, suspend and attack freedom of expression and movement, weaponize laws to silence critical media, deny the right to fair trial, and define arbitrarily and very broadly what constitute act of terrorism. What we are told as temporary measures are fast becoming permanent and his regime's new normal. And this is through the enactment of anti-terrorism law, which we are opposing very, very, very strongly. So the template of Duterte's politics of emergency, which was initiated 3 years ago by act of terror, such as the deadly war on illegal drugs and purely military solution to the complex problems in Marawi, is still evolving and being perfected by the use of armed forces as his default response to any situation. So again, the civic space is now a controlled territory here in the Philippines. But we in the labor movement, however, shall not concede whatever is left of the democratic space. Through strong solidarity and forging broader unity and alliances across the ideological and political spectrum in the Philippines and internationally, we shall assert on the truth that we believe in and stand for the truth. We shall continue to expose and confront lies and manipulative information. We shall continue to mobilize and optimize the use of online platforms and other avenues to counter the narrative of Duterte's capistocracy. We shall persevere and petition oversight branches of the government, the legislature, the judiciary, and constitutional bodies, even if we do recognize that those public institutions are populated by Duterte's cohorts. We will keep our faith in international and multilateral bodies, such as the United Nations, to elevate and put our case on behalf of the people. This because we truly believe that at the heart of a truly healthy Philippines is democracy and freedom and nothing less. So thank you very much, Randi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Annie. And I think it's important, what you just said about ensuring that we expose, persist, not lose hope, particularly in a situation where Duarte has used democracy to actually maintain autocracy is really, really important. And so thank you. And we are there with you and for you and with and as an international body to continue to fight for human rights. And I want to introduce next someone who knows that firsthand, knows that fight so much, Jalila Al-Salman, who is the co-founder and the vice president of the Bahrain, Teachers Association, and the general coordinator of the Human Rights Observatory in Bahrain. It's not just that the title doesn't actually speak what Jalila has been through. She was imprisoned and tortured for students' rights to participate in the Arab Spring. And, as we all have said to Annie and our other leaders in Philippines beforehand, we know that sometimes it's global solidarity that focuses the attention and the pressure on the changes that are needed, just like the protest movement is doing in the United States right now in the wake of George Floyd. And that's what helped get Jalila out of jail. But Jalila, we'd like you to talk about, first off, to thank you, and we are so grateful that you are with us today and grateful for everything that you have done and honored by your presence. But what are the challenges in fighting for democracy and unionism in a government that is so anti-democratic? Thank you, Jalila.
Thank you very much, Randi, for this impressive introduction. And I will start by saying that standing for democracy can mean losing so many things that make up your life. But it depends on the first place on your faith in your values and what difference it will make. The struggle for democracy and a free public education can become a heavy burden on you as a person, as a trade union, or for your members. This requires a huge commitment and sacrifice. Let me tour you in the 19 years journey started by establishing the Bahrain Teacher Association and now ending with being elected as member of Executive Board of Education International. Teachers have no union rights by law in Bahrain. So our aim was to set up a professional association. In 2001, DTA was the first organization in the history of Bahrain to bring together teachers to defend their rights and interests. BTS soon became well known. The Ministry of Education also knew BTA, but it labeled it as an enemy, not as a social partner. Our organization was strong and therefore intimidating and possibly dangerous for the ruling elite. The Teacher Association The Teacher Association became powerful because it represents many teachers, including migrant ones, and because our union leadership has always practiced a democratic decision-making by involving teachers in adoption of decisions. This was completely innovative in a country that did not believe in the concepts of trade unions. In February 2001, during the Arab Spring, our association joined the Peer Square reformative pro-democracy movement. Our union leaders were arrested one after the other. We were tortured to extract confessions. All board members were released except the president, Mahdi Abu Dib, and myself, the vice president. We were unjustly kept in detention despite international outrage. We were condemned by military court to long prison sentences for exercising our right to freedom of assembly and demanding a democratic and educational reforms. DTA BTA was dissolved by Ministry of Social Development while the union leaders were still in jail. Mahdi stayed in jail for 5 years and I stayed for 6 months. I was released before him and resumed my union work. What happened to us posed a challenge. Shall we give up or continue our right for social justice and democracy? The answer was clear. We continued. We faced different kinds of punishment. Losing our jobs, imprisonment, travel bans, treated as terrorists, and summoned several times to be questioned by the terrorist prosecutors, and so on. We decided to put ourselves as union leaders in the firefight. Teachers and students are not safe, and they should not be exposed. The channel with the education minister is blocked, but we worked on different levels, as unionists and as a human rights defenders. I was one, as you said, of the founders of Bahrain Human Rights Observatory. We built alliances at the national, regional, and international level. We are working with the Human Rights Council, and we are extensively using their mechanisms to report on human rights violations. We maintained relations with our colleagues in the Arab world. At the global level, EI has provided us with the much needed support and is still doing so. We were sure that joining Education International will give us an international recognition and will support our fight for democratic change and inclusive education in Bahrain. We were right. Lately, during the COVID-19 crisis, our union has mobilized to support teachers and students. The union's priority is to ensure the health and safety, and that all students receive online education without discrimination. BTA has also raised concerns about the effectiveness and equity of distance learning. We turned this crisis into an opportunity to better connect with our grassroots members and defend their rights. We had also developed a policy for school reopening that we want to see adopted. We hope so. Through strategic alliances with civil society and parliamentary members, we managed to make our voice heard within the Ministry of Education and to win the right for all teachers to work from home. BTA is still banned, and we are working to gain its legalization. But the context remains challenging. Both the union president and I are still dismissed, and they refuse to reinstate us in our teaching position, but we are committed. We know that trade unions are often the only institutions that give voices to the workers and their communities who are neglected by those in power. More important still, we are the organizations that stand against authoritarian regime and social injustice. International solidarity means a lot to us, and I want to thank everybody for listening and for supporting us. Thank you, Randi.
Thank you, Jalila, so much. And thank you again for your courage and your conviction and for your fight. And we are with you, as you know. And thank you for speaking in English in a way that all of us could hear. So we really, really, really appreciate it. I know that it is something that you were amazingly perfect, and I know it's something that you do and get concerned about, but you were just we are all moved by everything that has happened with you. I want to actually introduce our last speaker, who is going to speak in Spanish, and so please, those of us who need the translation, please remember interpretify and put in Democracy 2020. Carolina Espinoza Tapia is the Vice President of PSI's Inter-American Women's Committee and the Gender Officer of CONFUSAM, the Confederation of Municipal Health Workers in Chile. And Carolina recently, Carolina will speak for a few minutes about the massive popular uprisings against the government that we've seen in Chile with the demands for a new constitution. And again, just like in the United States, from students, from workers, from citizens. And Carolina is deeply involved in the movement. And what can you tell us about that movement? And what are the lessons that you've learned? And what are the lessons that you can tell the rest of us in terms of how we do the kind of fight that we've been talking about all morning long? Thank you, Carolina.
Hola, hola a todas, a todos.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank all the organizers. Chile is probably an extreme case at world level of neoliberalism. If we analyze the cases of the United States or United Kingdom, well, they are both more to the center than Chile. Let us take the inequality Gini coefficient. United States scores 0.39, United Kingdom 0.39, but Chile only scores, or rather, scores 0.45. In America, there's 1% of the richest that have 20% of GDP. In Chile, 1% of the people have 36% of the GDP. Why? Well, the poorer are poorer than in the States, and the richer are richer, because they don't always have to pay taxes. They practice tax evasion and tax fraud. We have a legal system which is an inheritance of the Pinochet dictatorship, and it privileges private property above all else. The labor code allow for businessmen to have all sorts of possibilities to commit crimes without having to go to jail. All they have to do is to go on ethics courses. 3 decades after the end of the dictatorship, we can see that democratic governments haven't really made an effort to rebuild public services and to increase public spending. In fact, the public service crisis has been exacerbating. In the past, most public services were in fact a public-private partnership, and that has continued to be so. One of the examples of abuses in Chile is the so-called managers of pension funds. They make everyone pay on an individual basis, and they offer very, very low pensions to workers, and they only work in favor of rich businessmen. For about 15 years, we have been seeing, in the context of a social struggle, different kinds of resistance, mostly linked to education, health, pensions, the environment, indigenous peoples, water resources. We have to consider that in spite of having many rivers, there are many places in rural areas that don't really have access to water resources. Why? Well, because water resources are in private hands. This is unprecedented in any other part of the world. In Chile, also, different social and environmental leaders have died in strange circumstances. In spite of all this, we have been making progress in our alliances. We like to work bottom-up in a very different way. We believe in assemblies, in autonomy, in gender parity, and that is the basis of any kind of alliances. And the main thing is unity, because we understand that our struggles cut across sectorial lines. There used to be small struggles in the past, one for public education, one for gender equality, but we understand now that they are all part of the same problem. The problem is the neoliberal, patriarchal, predating and abusive economic model that we have to fight. In this pandemic and in the midst of this economic crisis, we can see that our president new laws to increase the control on society. The rate of COVID-19 is particularly high in vulnerable populations in Chile. In Chile, the government is only providing small handouts to the population, and many people are not really able to self-isolate because they have to make ends meet. At the same time, we are organizing kitchen soups. We are organizing different ways to get people to survive. All our life and democracy has become precarious. In fact, democracy in Chile is just an illusion. That is why in October this year, Chile woke up. We started a new process which hasn't ended yet and which filled us with enthusiasm. We want a new constitution for a new country, for a new Chile, which allows for full democracy. We want to also incorporate terms of deliberation and decision making, such as consultation and binding, referendum, the popular initiatives law, for example. And just to wrap up, let me say that I think that the world is at a crossroads, and it's even more important now than ever to fight the neoliberal kind of development. We need structural and cultural changes that will do away with individualism and competition in order to bring back solidarity and the democratic culture that we need. We're in the midst of a sanitary and an economic crisis, and we run the risk of losing rights and losing social justice. We need a tax reform, a fairer tax reform, a progressive tax system that will allow for quality social services and good working conditions for public service workers. I think that is fundamental if we want to achieve a fairer and a more solidarity-based society. In Chile, we say that we live, we will come back, and we will win this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so, I just want to make sure thank you so much. And I want to thank Mugwena and Annie and Jalila and Carolina for their experiences and for speaking with all of us. I know we had a hard stop at 9 o'clock, so what I'm going to do, and I saw so many questions in the chat room, but I want to just turn it back over to David Edwards so that David and Rosa can do some final chat from us. I know we have the interpreters have said that they will go a few more minutes. And I just want to just say to both David and Rosa and to Dave and Susan, thank you for, and I'm honored that I was able to moderate today. Thank you. Turning it over to David Edwards.
Thank you so much, Randi. I want to also add my thanks to my good troublemaking comrade in arms, Rosa, because this takes work. For us to come together as PSI and EI at this time, it's actually an existential moment for us. And as Reverend Sharpton said, this is a transformational moment. It can't be a transactional moment. It can't be a moment for transactional leadership. It can't be a moment to just lick your finger and put your finger up in the wind and see which way is the wind blowing. This is the time when the trade union movement and those of us in public services must come together around our principles and our values. We must, as the Reverend said, we must join forces with our natural allies in the civil rights movement, in the women's movement, in the climate movement, in the economic justice movement, in the racial justice movement. This is the time not for egos, this is the time for real transformational leadership, to lead on ideas, to lead on principles, and to lead on values. We're facing, as Susan and Randi and everyone else has said, a confluence of crises that we have to take on all of those. And we've been here before, but this time is different. This time, because of the pandemic, is shining a light on the essential role of frontline workers for democracy, for civil rights, for racial equality, and for social justice. The time is to create the climate. And we're good at that. We're good at mobilizing, as Mugwena says, creating the organization, just like they did in the anti-apartheid movement, not just to check the thermostat, No, not just to check the thermometer, but to actually change the thermostat, to create the conditions. And that one constant is that alliance of trade unions and civil rights fighters. We spent a lot of time over these past decades, a lot of energy and a lot of resources kind of looking over our shoulders and not always looking forward in the way that we need to. But what Rose and I want to signal with this, and Dave and Susan and everybody else, is we're in this together. This is the fight for the planet. It's the fight for social justice. It's the fight for the future of our children, for the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of economy that's based on an essential economy, as the Professor Mariana said, not just an economy that works for the fewest 1%, but one that actually pays a citizen's dividend back to workers, that has built-in institutionalized dialogue, workers at the table. We know what works. We know the evidence. We know what solidarity can do. We know what organization can do, and we are going to do it. And it is just the greatest pleasure and honor, and I'm so humbled by all of you listening and being part of this beginning of a discussion. And on behalf of Education International, its members, we want to thank PSI and all those behind the scenes who've been working to make this possible. We will continue this debate, this dialogue. We will continue this collaboration together because we must. It's who we are. It's what we do. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my sister, Rosa Pavanelli, to close out. Rosa.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for this conference, for participating and bringing your contribution. And let me also take the opportunity to thank the interpreters and to thank PSI NDI staff that have been working quite hard during the past weeks to organize this. We got a lot of insights from our members that brought their experience in the fight for workers' rights and democracy. But let me try to focus why we, the two Global Federation of Public Service Workers, felt that we need to put democracy at the center of our discussion. Well, I think that it's easy said. The first thing is that we are the radar as public service workers of what is happening in the society. We know beforehand which kind of change in the demographic, in economics, in the social and the cultural environment of our community are happening because people ask us to provide adequate response to their need. And as I like to say, is that as public service workers, we are the factory of rights, of human and civil rights. And this is why I think in many parts of the world where authoritarian and anti-democratic governments are there, we continue to be discriminated and targeted. And if we look at the scenario, global scenario, when it comes for workers that are prevented to form a union and to collective bargaining, they are often teachers, nurses, firefighters, public service workers, because everyone knows how important they are for society. And we are the barrier against anti-democratic tendencies. I appreciated very much what Professor Mazzucato said when she talked about, well, it's time to start knowing how to value the outcomes of public services. Everybody talking how much they impact on the public debt, how much they impact on the GDP, how much they impact in the general cost of a state, but nobody values how much they bring in terms of the economy to the society. And I think that COVID-19 beyond the toll of suffering and deaths and trauma to our society, gives us the possibility to value how much public services contributed to support the real economy of our communities, to bring our society working, and to reduce the impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable. But it's also true another thing that Reverend Al Sharpton highlighted very strongly, and it is the fact that we have been told that we are all in at the same level in this pandemic. That's not true. The most vulnerable, those who suffered the most in the past, continue to be the most affected by the pandemic, by the economic crisis, by the environmental crisis, and by all the social injustice that is undermining our living together in our communities. And let me just give you an example. We worked a lot during the Ebola crisis, and nobody cared very much about it until the first case reached the United States and the UK. And then all in a sudden, the world realized that an epidemic was possible. And here we are in now, that there's this reaction because the developed world is affected. But I want to say that we need to be very, very much committed to look at what will happen in the least developed countries, in the developing world, because what can happen there with the pandemic and the following economic crisis can be much, much worse for all the world, even if the richest countries are going to recover. And let me say that also the racial injustice is not just something happening in the United States. It's happening everywhere. And we need to get committed to fight racism, to fight fascism, to fight all form of authoritarian and unjust powers. Because it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Amazonia, where native people have left dying without any assistance. It's happening on the border with Syria, in the refugee camps where nobody is going to provide assistance to refugees. It's happening to the people left floating on the Mediterranean Sea, coming from the south of the world to find a better life. And I also think that there's another theme that we need to put at the center of our fight for justice and democracy. And this other theme is the gender inequality. We have not been mentioning it today, but we were mainly women talking, and it says a lot about our unions and the commitment that we have on gender as EI and PSI this. But it continues to be the biggest injustice in the world. Half of the world excluded, half of the population excluded from equality. And this has to be another part of our fight. Democracy means recognition of the value of each one of us, the recognition of our needs to have satisfied the fundamental human rights. And we, as essential public service workers, we know the value that we bring to our society. The change that we are expecting in the future is not back to business as usual, even if we have already heard that there might be you know, the attempt to soften the discourse, but bringing the same economic model at the center of the new normality. That's not what we want. What we want is that our work as public service workers is valued, is recognized, our dignity, our wages, our working conditions, our right to have a union and to have collective bargaining, and that government and state retake in their hands the capacity to regulate and to provide the services that are needed to make their community work. This is the essential of democracy. Thank you very much, and thanks again to all of you, and particularly to David, because I think our alliance has a long way ahead, but we will walk together.